Montana Territory, January 1887. The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Bitterroot Range, tearing through the pine trees and driving snows sideways in thick, blinding sheets. Eleanor Graves could barely breathe. Her bare fingers clawed at the frozen earth as she dragged herself forward, her skirts soaked and stiff, her boots long gone. Every breath burned, every inch of her skin stung raw. The wagon was gone along with her uncle, aunt, and cousins. They had taken the horses, the food, the blankets. Left her with nothing but a threadbare shawl and a broken wagon wheel lodged in a snowbank. They did not want her any more. She had heard them whispering for weeks about how she was too much trouble. Her father long buried, her mother gone in childbirth, and she 20 and unmarried was just another mouth for them to feed. She had tried to be useful, tried to cook, clean, keep quiet. But it had not been enough. And this morning, when the storm rolled in and she went to gather firewood, they left. Her legs gave out. Eleanor collapsed into the snow, snowflakes catching in her lashes. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She could not feel her arms anymore. The wind screamed above her. She closed her eyes. Then, faint through the roar, came the sound of hooves. She blinked. Could have been in her head. Could be death coming quiet. But then the hooves stopped. A heavy dismount. Crunch of boots. A man's voice, low and rough with cold. God Almighty! Strong arms lifted her. She moaned half from pain, half from disbelief. Easy, he said, wrapping her in something warm. A coat. Thick. Smelled like leather and pine. You're safe now. I've got you. He cradled her like she weighed nothing. She tried to open her eyes, but all she saw was his jaw lined with snow, set hard like stone. Then everything went black. Eleanor woke to warmth. Fire crackled near her feet, and light flickered across rough-hewn log walls. Her body ached, but she was wrapped in quilts, her hands tucked into wool mittens. She stirred. Something shifted nearby. You're awake. The man sat beside the hearth, feeding the fire. He was tall, broad-shouldered under a flannel shirt, his hair dark and messy from the wind. His face was sun-worn and serious, but his eyes, when they met hers, held something softer. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry. He reached for a tin cup on the table and helped her drink. You were near frozen, he said. Found you 3 miles west of the trail, curled up by a busted wagon. She coughed. They left me. I figured. She looked at him. Who are you? Thatcher Lane. He poured another cup. Own this land. Cabin's mine. Was riding back from town when I saw the tracks. Eleanor Graves, she whispered. He nodded. You're safe here, Eleanor. She believed him. The next day, she could sit up. Thatcher had bandaged her feet, rubbed salve into her frostbitten hands, fed her hot stew and let her sleep. He was quiet, but kind. Every time she woke, he was nearby chopping wood, mending gear, or fixing something with quiet focus. She watched him from her cot. His hands were thick with calluses. His coat hung by the door, coated in snow. There was no woman's touch in the cabin, no lace, no embroidery, no softness. Just him. Do you live alone? She asked one morning. He paused. Always have. She nodded. Why'd they do it? He asked, not looking at her. My uncle said I was a burden. That no excuse. No. She swallowed. But I guess it was enough for them. He finally looked over. They do not deserve to draw breath. She blinked. No one had ever defended her like that. He stood and handed her a bowl of stew. Their fingers brushed. Her heart fluttered small, unsure, but there. Days passed. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, there was warmth. Eleanor's strength returned. She could stand now, walk slowly. Thatcher let her help stir the stew, mend a torn sleeve, feed the fire. Every evening, they sat by the hearth. He told her about the land, how he had built the cabin himself, broke horses in the summers, hunted elk in the fall. He had been orphaned young, raised by a cattleman down near Helena who died when he was 16. Since then, it had been just him. "I figured I was meant to be alone," he said one night, staring into the flames. Eleanor sat beside him, her quilt tucked around her knees. "I know that feeling." He looked at her. "But I do not believe that anymore." Her breath caught. He reached for her hand. "You came into my life like a storm, Eleanor. And I do not want you to leave it." She looked at their hands, his large and rough, hers small and still healing. "I have no family," she said. "No dowry. Nothing to offer. Do not want what you had. Just want who you are." She blinked fast. Her chest ached, but not from cold. "I never knew someone could care about me like this," she whispered. His hand held hers tighter. "I do." She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her. Outside, the blizzard still howled. But in the cabin, there was only warmth. And in their hearts, something new had begun, strong, quiet, and real. The wind calmed sometime after the third morning. Eleanor stood by the narrow window, hands wrapped in a flannel scarf, watching the low sun stretch across a world turned white and silent. The snow hung from the trees in thick folds, and the only movement came from the slow drift of smoke rising from the chimney. Behind her, Thatcher was sharpening a hatchet. The rhythmic scrape of metal against stone was the only sound in the room. She turned from the window. "Will your livestock be all right in this cold?" He didn't pause. "I built the stable tight. They've got hay, bedding, and a windbreak. Still, I'll check them again before dark. Can I go with you?" She kept her voice steady, though her heart beat faster at the thought of stepping outside again. Thatcher set down the blade and looked up. "Only if you wear my buffalo coat. I'll try not to trip over it." There was a trace of warmth in his eyes. He stood and helped her into it, tugging the collar up around her ears. The weight of it made her feel anchored, as though nothing could sweep her off again. They walked out into the stillness. The snow had crusted over, brittle underfoot. He led the way, cutting a path with his boots. The stable was a squat structure tucked against a rise of rock and pine. Inside, the smell of animals and straw was earthy and thick. 2 horses stood in their stalls, tails flicking lazily. A roan gelding nickered when Thatcher approached. "This one's Boone," he said, brushing frost from the horse's mane. "Been with me since '83. Smarter than most men I've met." Eleanor ran her hand along the stall rail. "I've never ridden." He glanced over. "You will." They worked in silence. She handed him grain while he checked hooves and adjusted blankets. Her fingers, gloved and stiff, fumbled with a latch. He didn't rush her. When they returned to the cabin, her cheeks were flushed, and there was a steadier rhythm in her step. That night she braided a length of cord from spare wool yarn, her fingers nimble again. Thatcher sat by the fire, working a strip of rawhide into a rein. The quiet wasn't heavy, it settled between them like a shared breath. "Did you ever think of leaving?" she asked. He kept his eyes on his hands. "Once. Before I finished the cabin. Thought about Texas. Maybe Wyoming. But I don't like the way towns grow. The noise. The hurry." She nodded. "I used to dream of St. Louis. But now I think I wanted it because I thought it would mean something. That I wasn't just someone left behind." Thatcher set the rein aside. "You ain't behind. You're here." She blinked slowly, the firelight catching in her lashes. "You make it sound like that matters." "It does." He didn't say anything else, but he didn't need to. She could feel the truth of it in the silence that followed. The next morning, the sky cleared. Blue stretched wide over the hills, and the snow had stopped drifting. Thatcher hitched Boone to a sled he'd rigged with ropes and planks. "I'm going to see what's left out there," he said. "You stay here. I want to go." He studied her. "You're sure?" She met his gaze. "I need to see it." They traveled slow. The sled creaked over the snow, and Eleanor held fast to the edge, her legs wrapped in pelts. The wagon lay as they'd left it, half buried in drift, the canvas torn, one of the wheels snapped clean through. She stood beside it, breath fogging the air. There was no sign of her uncle's tracks, not even a trail to follow. Just the broken shell of what had carried her west. She reached into the wreckage and pulled out a tin box. Inside was a sewing kit, a bent thimble, and a square of muslin she'd embroidered months ago. A single wildflower, stitched in pale blue thread. Thatcher didn't speak. She held the cloth in both hands, then folded it and tucked it into her coat. "I'm done looking back." He offered his hand. She took it. When they returned to the cabin, she hung the cloth above the hearth on a nail she found in the wall. It swayed slightly in the warm air. That night she set 2 bowls on the table without asking. Thatcher brought a pan of beans and salt pork. They ate in quiet, but it was no longer the quiet of strangers. Afterward, he lit a candle and opened a small drawer in the corner. Inside was a worn notebook filled with pencil sketches, animals, trees, the outline of the ridge behind the cabin. She turned a page. Her breath caught. A woman's face, half-finished, eyes strong, mouth soft. She looked up. "I started that last week," he said. "Didn't plan to show it." Her fingers brushed the edge of the page. "You see me clearer than I do." He reached across the table and touched her wrist, light as breath. "I see you." Eleanor didn't look away. Neither did he. The candle burned between them, steady and warm. The first thaw came slow. Not with sun, but with silence, the kind that settled over the land when the wind no longer pushed and the trees no longer groaned. In that hush, the snow began to soften at its edges. Thatcher was mending a cracked beam above the door when Eleanor stepped outside without asking. He looked down from the ladder, his brow furrowed until he saw she'd taken his second coat off the peg and buttoned it wrong. "You left the mittens behind," he said, voice even. "I needed to feel something," she answered, arms crossed, fingers pink at the knuckles. He climbed down. "You could have said so. I've been quiet a long time. Forgot what asking feels like." He didn't press her further. Instead, he walked beside her as she made her way to the ridge behind the cabin, where the trees gave way to open sky and the land sloped toward the frozen creek. She stopped at the edge and stared out. "You ever think about how far a person can see, even when they don't know where they're going?" she asked. "I think about what's worth seeing," he replied, his breath visible in the cold. "That's different." She turned toward him. "I didn't come west expecting much. Just a roof and a place to not be a burden. But I think I hoped someone might look at me and not see just another mouth." "You think I see you that way?" "No. That's what scares me." He didn't speak, but he did step closer, his shoulder brushing hers. They stood like that until the cold seeped through the coat seams and she shivered. Back inside, she pulled off her boots and sat by the hearth, rubbing her palms together. Thatcher knelt to stoke the fire, then stayed there, crouched, one knee on the floor. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about what happens when spring comes. You're free to go wherever you want. But I'd be lying if I said I want to see you ride off." She looked at him, her face unreadable. "And if I stay? What does that look like?" He sat back on his heels. "You'd have a place here. Not out of pity. Not because I found you in the snow. But because I'd want you here every day after. I don't want to be kept. That's not what I'm offering." She studied him. "I don't know how to belong to anyone. My whole life's been spent trying not to take up space. I've got space to give, Eleanor. And I'd be proud if you filled it." She looked down at her hands, her fingers still raw but steadier now. "You always speak plain. I've had no one to lie to." That night she didn't sleep on the cot. She sat near the fire until the candle burned low, then rose and crossed to where he sat repairing the leather strap of his saddlebag. "I'm not afraid of the cold," she said. "But I'm tired of waking up alone." He set the strap aside. "I'll build you a bed of your own if that's what you want," I want to wake up beside someone who sees me. He stood, and when he reached for her, it wasn't hurried. His hand settled at her waist, gentle, certain. I do, he said. She leaned into him, and the quiet between them shifted, no longer cautious, but sure. Later, as the coals dimmed to gray, she lay beside him beneath the quilts, her head against his shoulder, her fingers tracing the edge of his collarbone. I don't know what the world outside this cabin looks like anymore, she murmured. Doesn't have to be anything more than this, if you don't want it to. She smiled against his chest. I think I want this. The fire crackled once, soft and low. And outside the snow began to melt down into the soil that would soon turn to spring. By late February, the creek behind the ridge had begun to run again. The sound was faint, but Eleanor heard it while she was gathering kindling near the stable, just beneath the hush of the pines, the soft trickle of thawed water pushing past the ice. She straightened slowly and listened, her breath clouding in the air. The earth was shifting beneath winter's grip, and something in her chest echoed the same loosening. When she returned to the cabin, Thatcher had cleared the table and was sharpening the edge of a draw knife, his sleeves rolled above the elbows. He glanced up when she entered, but instead of speaking, he waited. You were right, she said, setting the basket of wood near the hearth. It's running again. The creek. He nodded once. Won't be long now. She crossed the room and leaned beside the stove, watching the blade flash in his hands. There was care in the way he worked, not just precision, but attention that made her feel steady just watching. Did you ever think about building something more? She asked. Beyond this cabin, I mean. He set the blade down. You thinking about a bigger place? Not bigger. Just something we shape together. Maybe next to the creek. With space for a garden. I've got cedar planks stacked in the lean-to, curing since last fall. Meant for a barn, but I could spare some. She folded her arms. We could make the barn too. I've never raised chickens, but I think I'd like to try. He pushed back from the table. Then we'll build both. Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. It was the first time either of them had spoken about the next season with certainty. Not just surviving, but staying. Building. Thatcher stood and reached for his coat. I'm going to check the far fence. That last wind might have dropped more limbs. She followed to the door, helping him fasten the strap on his saddlebag. Be careful on the ridge. That snow's not done shifting. He paused, then lifted her hand and pressed it to his chest, just once, before pulling the door shut behind him. She watched him go, the shape of him steady against the snow-patched slope until the trees took him. Inside, the cabin felt different. Not empty, but waiting. She moved to the shelf above the hearth and took down a box she hadn't opened since the day he'd brought her back. Inside was the piece of muslin she'd embroidered long ago, the wildflower still intact, the thread pale but unbroken. She unfolded it slowly, then reached for the spare piece of wood Thatcher had left near the stove. With a steady hand, she began stitching the cloth to the wood, anchoring the corners with tiny nails. Her stitches were tighter now, more certain. It was hung by the window before he returned. That evening, he carried in a branch of dry alder and set it down by the hearth. You were right, he said, brushing snow from his collar. 2 posts cracked clean through. I'll need to cut new ones before the thaw pulls them loose. I'll come with you tomorrow, she said, moving to the stove. You'll need someone to hold the line steady while you dig. You sure your strength's back? I'm not made of glass, Thatcher. He grinned, not wide, but enough to crease the corner of his cheek. Didn't say you were. Just means I'll have to work harder to keep up. She handed him a plate, steam rising from the beans and salt pork she'd cooked while he was out. He took it, then looked past her to the cloth above the window. You did that today? She nodded. It felt like the right time. His gaze lingered there for a moment, then returned to her. I want to ask you something. Not because I need an answer now. Just because I've been thinking on it. She set her own plate down, her hands still on the edge of the table. Go on. If we build that house by the creek. If we plant that garden, and raise those chickens. Would you let it be as my wife? The words settled over the room like dust in sunbeams, slow and sure. She didn't hesitate. Yes. I would. He stepped forward, the plate still in his hand, forgotten. She reached for him, and they stood there, close enough to feel the warmth of each other's breath. I never thought I'd be someone's choice, she whispered. You were mine the moment I saw you in that snow, he said, voice low. Not because of what happened before, but for everything that's come after. Her hands found his, still calloused, still steady. Then let's build it. Let's make it ours. Outside, the creek ran faster, and above the ridge, the clouds broke open to the stars. The last of the snow shrank into the roots and ruts of the earth by the second week of March. Mud clung to boots, and the air smelled of thawed moss and wet bark. Beneath the eaves of the cabin, a pair of swallows built a nest from pine needles and horsehair, darting through the warming air like they'd never known cold. Eleanor stood at the edge of the clearing, a hoe in her hand, the hem of her dress stained with soil. Rows of turned ground stretched before her in uneven lines. Her arms ached, but she didn't mind. Dirt under her nails no longer meant struggle, it meant something was beginning. Behind her, the rhythmic thump of hammer against wood echoed from the slope where the new foundation was taking shape. Thatcher had set the first beams 2 mornings ago, and now the frame stood shoulder high, latticed with pine and cedar, and his steady labor. He worked with the same quiet focus she remembered from that first week, but now he paused to meet her eyes when she passed and touched her arm when she brought him bread or water. That evening, she found him crouched beside the new hearth, measuring the depth of the stone trench he'd laid by hand. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, and sawdust flecked his wrists. She knelt beside him, brushing damp hair from his forehead without a word. He leaned into her touch, his mouth brushing the inside of her palm. We'll have the roof on by end of month. She laid her hand over his. What about the windows? I traded for glass panes in town last week. Stored them in the barn till we're ready. She nodded, fingers tightening around his. I want to sew curtains. Blue, maybe. Like the sky after a storm. He looked at her then, not just with affection, but with that rooted stillness that had grown between them like something planted deep. You'll make it beautiful. They stayed like that till the sun slipped behind the hills, and the frogs began their low chorus down by the creek. The days that followed were full with work. Eleanor stitched long into the evenings by lantern light, her hands steady over linen salvaged from an old quilt. She learned the call of the owls that nested near the ridge, and the way Thatcher liked his coffee strong, no sugar. He taught her how to set a post straight using only a length of twine in her eye, and she taught him how to mend a button without poking his thumb. One afternoon, as they cleared brush near the back fence, a rider approached from the east trail. Eleanor stiffened, but Thatcher stepped forward without hesitation. The man dismounted slowly, his coat dusted with travel and his boots worn through. He introduced himself as Jesse Caldwell, a circuit preacher out of Missoula, come through the valley to offer spring blessings and news from town. Thatcher offered him water and shade, and Eleanor stood beside the fence, her hands folded. You two settled here alone? Jesse asked, eyes flicking between them. Eleanor answered first. We are. Together. Jesse nodded, then turned to Thatcher. You planning to marry the girl? She's not a girl, Thatcher said evenly. And yes. We are. Jesse looked at her again, this time with more care. I'll be in the valley another week. If you want it done proper, I can read the words. Eleanor felt Thatcher glance toward her, waiting, but not pressing. She stepped forward. We'd like that. They married 3 days later under a sky so clear it felt like the world had been scrubbed clean. Jesse stood beneath the tall pine near the creek's bend, a leather-bound Bible in his hands. Eleanor wore a dress she'd let down from the hem and stitched with a line of wildflowers along the collar. Thatcher had shaved, though a shadow still clung to his jaw by midday. The ceremony was short. No guests, no songs. Just the wind in the trees, the hush of water over stone, and their hands joined between them. When Jessie spoke the final words, Eleanor looked up and saw Thatcher watching her the way a man watches something he's chosen to protect all his life. Not with possession, but with reverence. They kissed once, soft and certain, and the preacher tipped his hat and mounted his horse without asking for coin. That night, they sat on the cabin steps and watched the stars blink to life. Thatcher pulled her close, wrapping the quilt she'd stitched across both their shoulders. Her head rested against his chest, the steady beat of his heart grounding her like the roots of the pines behind them. "I used to think I was meant to survive quiet," she said. "But this. It's more than that." He kissed her hair. "It's living." The house was finished by late May. It stood near the creek, framed by alder and pine, with a porch that caught the morning sun. Inside, the walls held the scent of cedar and smoke, and every beam bore the mark of their hands. The garden took shape in narrow rose beans, carrots, and early squash. A coop housed 4 hens and a russet-feathered rooster Eleanor named Hickory. She laughed the first time he crowed at dawn, then threw a pillow at the window. Thatcher built a table from a fallen spruce, polished smooth and edged with raw bark. Eleanor set it with 2 plates, 2 cups, and a vase of wild flowers each morning. She no longer flinched when the wind rose. No longer looked for signs of departure in the faces of those she loved. Each evening, they walked the ridge together as the sun bled gold through the trees. Sometimes they spoke of the day's work. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. It didn't matter. They were not alone. Not forgotten. Not broken. And when summer came, it came to a home already filled with warmth, with laughter, and with a quiet, hard-earned love that would not be shaken. They never left the land. Never needed to. Everything they wanted they'd built together, from the frostbitten beginning to the steady hearth they now called home.